Well, hello there, little masters, and welcome to the Prancing Pony Podcast, where tonight, Shawn and I are enjoying as much of the good stuff as we can for ourselves, for courage.
Well, all I can say is I'm just glad it does come in pints. West to how, my friends, or quarts. West to how, my friends, I'm Shawn Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the man of the West, the knob to my bob, Alan Sisto.
Oh, goodness, I really don't like the sound of that. Thank you, Shawn. Folks, tonight we are proud to welcome several of our patrons to the Old Inn of Bree for the first ever Questions After Nightfall episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast, where you're about to hear a little unscripted Q&A. We have guests online with us, thanks to the miracle of modern technology, and we've asked them to come with some of their very best questions. Now, we have no idea what they're going to ask us, so Shawn and I are going to be answering questions on the fly as best we can. That is where it's going to get interesting.
Yeah, I think interesting is a good word for it, Alan. But I am looking forward to it. And anyway, as old Harry Goatleaf, the gatekeeper in Bree, says, it's my business to ask questions after nightfall. Mm-hmm. Well, tonight it's our guest's business to ask questions after nightfall, and it's our business to answer them. So we'll do the best we can. It's probably going to have some ums and some I don't knows and some I'll get back to yous and some
lots of back to yous.
Gee, I never even read that part of it. So we'll probably have a few of those. Probably a lot of nervous page flipping.
I'm sure there will be, even if it's ebook flipping. Yeah. But folks, we don't want you, our dear listeners, to be bored whilst we turn pages, so we will probably edit for the sake of brevity, but that's it. Everything you hear in this show will be recorded during this session. Mm-hmm. So bravery or foolishness, you decide.
And I guess now it's time for me to point out that if this is the first you're hearing of any of this, and you'd like to get in on the next Questions After Nightfall episode, go check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/Prancing Pony Pod. We'll be doing these Questions After Nightfall episodes every 3 months, assuming we don't crash and burn too badly with this one, which I think it'll all go quite well.
It very well might.
And we'll be inviting patrons at the Elrond's Honorarium tier and higher to join us for those. So if you're interested, go check it out there.
Definitely. You know, it's just one of the many ways we're trying to say thank you to our patrons, giving them the opportunity to publicly humiliate us, or if they're kind, just asking us questions to get to know us, your charming hosts, a little bit better.
There you go.
Do we have charming hosts, Shawn? Do you have a charming host in your closet? Because I don't have one here. Yeah. So without further ado, why don't we introduce the folks joining us? I will unmute you so that you can say hi to your fellow podcast listeners. If you would, please let them know your first name and where you're joining us from tonight, starting with Maya.
Maya Lavanen. So I'm Maya. You've probably heard about me on the questions before, and I'm from Michigan, and you're not joking. It is like 10 o'clock here.
Yes, it is.
It is late.
Well, we appreciate you staying up late for us. All right. Next up is D-May.
Hi, everybody. This is D-May. I'm from Fairbanks, Alaska, and it is not even 7 o'clock here, but it's dark and cold.
I bet it's both.
Part of that sounds great. The other part, maybe not so much.
All right. And now, Tim, if you're able to hear us, can you give everybody a hello?
Hello. It's good to see you guys.
Excellent. And where are you joining us from tonight, Tim?
Madison, Wisconsin.
Oh, my. All right. So we've got a couple folks from the Eastern Zone, at least. All right. Next up, we have Sharat
or
joining
Central,
us.
I think.
Central?
Central, right?
Wisconsin?
Michigan and Wisconsin, but Central.
Sharat, are you with us?
Yep, I'm there.
Excellent.
Hi, my name's Sharat, and I'm joining the show from Maryland.
Oh, wow. Okay, so now we actually do have an Eastern
There's our
coast.
East Coaster. All right.
There's our Eastern time zone, because you're right. I think Michigan and Wisconsin are Central.
Yep.
See, anything outside of California, I'm just like,
I know, they're all East to you.
They're all East to me. I'm the man of the West. That's why. All right.
Well, not today. We've got Fairbanks,
Not today,
Alaska.
definitely. Okay, let's see if Daniel's there.
Hello.
Daniel.
Yes, howdy, I suppose I should say. I'm over here in Houston.
Oh, in Houston. Okay, not too far from Shawn.
Yeah.
Down in my neck of the woods. That's right.
Welcome, and glad to have you with us.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
And finally, Lee, I'm not sure if your audio is working or not, but if it is, and you can hear us, can we hear you? We're not able to hear you right now, or maybe you don't know that I'm talking to you. So we'll come back to you when it's time for your question. Shawn, do you want to go ahead and open this up?
Yeah, why don't we do that? So let's see. We are going to be taking questions from folks here joining us. They're going to be notifying us online that they have a question. So let's see who wants to raise their hand first.
Yeah, who's going to raise their hand? There you go. All right,
we got
Maya.
Daniel up.
Oh, Daniel, you're right. I didn't see that hand go up first. All right, Maya, you're next. So, Daniel, all right.
All right.
What do you have for us?
So I was reading The Hobbit, and I was in an unexpected party just last Sunday, and I was not expecting to have so much fun. But I was reading where the narrator is talking about dragons, and he says they can't make a thing for themselves, not even mend a little loose scale of their armor. And so that got me thinking, there's quite a theme about finality in the Legendarium. When Morgoth was cut by the Elf King at the time, Fingolfin?
Fingolfin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The wound.
The wound never healed, and quite a few other things. When I think it might have been Maedhros, but when he lost his right hand, and he grew to wield the sword better in his left hand than he did his right.
Right.
Right. And I was just wondering, would you say that's kind of the same theme as the music of the Ainur, or is that a different theme, or how would you interpret that?
So you're thinking, help me.
We're talking about the theme of you talked about permanence or
connecting the finality to the music of the Ainur, right, Daniel?
Sure, yeah, or not if you don't see it connected.
I don't know. I mean, the first thing I think of when I think of somebody like Morgoth or Smaug, and this is probably off topic, but maybe I'll just start talking and we'll kind of come around to the question.
that happens a lot on this show.
Yes, it does. We digress. The first thing I think of with somebody like a Morgoth or a Smaug is just the inability to subcreate. The inability to kind of make anything themselves. Obviously, that's a huge running theme with Morgoth. We've talked about a lot.
Right.
Dragons, we've seen how much they love to take the work of others. They steal gold, they steal plunder and jewels and all that stuff. But the fact that Smaug can't make anything or even mend a scale of his armor, that tells me that they just don't have any sort of sub-creative ability like elves or men do, and I think it's just because of the degree of corruption and evil that's in them. How that relates to somebody like a Maedhros and his inability to grow his hand back, gosh, I don't know.
Well, to me that seems like it's not in the nature of a created being like an elf or a man or even a dwarf for that part to grow a limb back. I mean, we can't. So
right.
Why would an immortal elf be able to grow a limb back? They'll get it back when he gets rehoused, which sadly might be a bit. But it's again just kind of the nature of a creature as opposed to a creator. I mean, it's a little different when you're talking about an Ainu because they take form.
Sure.
I mean, they're not a being. They're still a created being, but they're not a being of flesh like an elf or a man.
No, the raiment. The old the metaphor we use of the raiment, or that Tolkien uses. Of the raiment.
Right. The raiment.
Yeah, they can swap out. I lost that watch. Let me swap out a new watch. But yeah, how that relates to the music.
Well,
I don't know.
I think. Here's the way I see it. The only connection I see, or at least the first connection I see, perhaps as we talk about it more, I'll see more, would be the connection between the fact that the music is creative and everybody else is a created thing. That's an inherent limitation in something that is created. But that doesn't really speak to things like the dragon's inability to fix a scale. I mean, a man could certainly fix a part of his plate armor. So why couldn't a dragon, fix his scale? I don't know. I don't know that I see any connection directly with the music. I'm starting to see something, and I wonder if this is what you're thinking of, okay. Daniel. And let me know if I'm kind of hitting close to the mark or if I'm just still way off. If the music is something that is still playing out in the real world. And if we are all, to some degree, instruments or phrases in the music,
we are all going to have a point at which we stop. We're all going to have a point at which, our part changes, and maybe changes forever, or changes until the point at which we finally exit the music. Our piece, our phrase, our musical phrase finally exits the music.
Okay.
And so maybe, I don't know, maybe there's something to that, this idea of just roles coming on and going off as the music plays out. Maybe there's a metaphor there. But then again, maybe it's just, maybe that metaphor is just describing the basic thing that happens in the world as people appear and disappear. So, I don't know, Daniel. I mean, is that kind of what you were thinking? I'm curious where you're going.
Yeah. So I guess where I was heading, and what you guys said makes sense, but I was thinking that there is direction, and evil is replaced by new evil, but evil is defeated, and good sustains good's defeated, or sustains injury and is replaced by new good. And you have and then you'd have maybe Frodo, who never really recovered after the end of Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
Presumably he got rest when he went to Valinor, or the Lonely Island, which I should know its name, but I don't.
Toleresia.
Yeah. See, there's an easy question.
Yeah, so I don't know. That's just what I thought was that there's just a direction, and when things play out, they make a difference, and they progress everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the music is, the story of fate, if you will, and so it makes sense that as things play out in time, that they are a reflection of the music. Obviously with some exceptions, the fact that men can do things beyond the music is a little different, but yeah.
It seems a bit like some of the stuff we've talked about with Boethius, with fate being the way that story plays out in time, and maybe that's what's going on there. But
you know what? We actually have Sharat's raising his hand here, and I think he has a thought on this one. Let me go ahead and unmute him. Sharat, you've got some thoughts on Daniel's question.
Yeah, so when I first heard Daniel's question, I thought that the direction he was asking about was that, it's described that men are the ones who have a certain special kind of free will as regards the music in terms of determining their fate. And I thought he was wondering whether you thought that the injuries that Morgoth or Smaug or Maedhros sustain would be something that was contained within the music.
Oh, I see. As opposed to something that they improvised themselves, something that was entirely of their own making, not part of the plan.
Right, and because of which they're unable to heal themselves.
Oh, that's an interesting thought.
Okay. Let me unmute Daniel real quick. Daniel, you heard Sharat's take on that. I wanted to see if that's kind of the direction you were headed, or just to clarify.
But I've
okay. That's a good insight. It's a good insight. Good question.
So coming at all this from, I kind of understood the Boethian views, and I never really understood the whole elves have less free will than men. So I never really thought of that.
Yeah, free will, but less free will. It's a hard thing to kind of ponder.
It is very hard to kind of wrap one's head around, and I'm not sure I have a really good explanation for it either.
I really think probably Flieger's got the best explanation of it. I'm trying to remember whether
from
it's
Splintered Light. You know what? I've actually
Light.
got that here. Let me see.
But really, if I'm trying to boil it down, and then we're going to move on to Maya's question. But if I were to boil it down, I would say that elves have the ability to shape their own responses to things. That is, when an external circumstance comes along, say the destruction of the trees, an elf like, say, Feanor could have decided to do something different than withhold the Silmarils. What he could not do is supersede or override the greater plan, through his actions. Whereas a man can go beyond that. He doesn't just control his own internal reaction emotionally and his own response. He controls more than that.
That is exactly the word.
Over that.
That's exactly the word that Flieger uses, Alan. I found it here in Splintered Light.
Okay.
It does say that men are given the power to act beyond the music, that is, to alter external events or circumstances.
There you go.
While elves, though bound by the music, have the freedom to make internal choices, to alter some attitude toward themselves of other creatures or errors. So they may have power. They may have power over their own natures, but not over external happenings.
There you go.
So I think you're right. I think it's something like Feanor choosing to withhold the Silmarils. That's his free will, but it's a response to
something that was in fate that was part of the music.
Right. And there's probably something there that says that the Silmarils were going to be be taken away from him one way or another, and so it was just his decision how that happened. Does he give them back to the Valar? Does he try to keep them himself and have them stolen from him? I think maybe that's what's going on there. So taking it back to Fingolfin and Morgoth, maybe I don't know, maybe Fingolfin and Morgoth were destined to fight, or maybe Morgoth was destined to be wounded. Fingolfin is the one who chooses to act by marching up to the gates of Angband and challenging him to single combat in the way that he does. But maybe maybe Fingolfin was destined to die and Morgoth was destined to be wounded.
That may be.
Whereas men maybe can do things, have a little bit more ability to act beyond the music. So maybe that's it.
I think that could be. I like that.
That's a fantastic question, Daniel. Thank you.
It was a great starter question. My goodness. Maya's up next. And Shawn, while I'm going to have you take the lead on Maya's question here in a moment because I'm trying to communicate with Lee, who is unfortunately having to resort to just typing. So I'm going to handle that while you start out the answer to Maya's question. So, Maya, what do you have for us?
Okay, I'm going to apologize in advance because this is a larger question, but I considered sending it through the bag, but it would be too unwieldy in typing, so here we go.
All right.
For me, and I think you guys, certainly when I've talked with you, you would have noticed this, anything involving the Númenóreans is what I gravitate to in the Legendarium, and that's from the very beginning of the Edain all the way up through the Fourth Age. Because of that, a topic that I've always found a little dissettling was the decline of the Númenóreans. Not the decline in that Númenor itself fell, but then how even those that remained faithful declined in Middle-earth and kind of faded into obscurity. But looking back, and this is where it's going to get a bit long, looking back all the way back, starting in the Tale of Adenel, and I'm trying to essentially piece out the larger purpose of them. So, in the Tale of Adenel, mankind falls, obviously. Only the few that escaped the north become either the middlemen or the Edain. And I think that and I'm not sure whether this was Spidimi or planned. In fact, I lean towards Spidimi because Númenor fell, but I wonder if almost the general purpose of the Númenóreans was to decline. And the reason I say that is because if we look at all of their traits, essentially what happened with the Númenóreans is they were made more elf-like while remaining fully human. Do you think it could be that because the humans had fallen very early on back when they worshipped Morgoth in the house, do you think it could be that the purpose of the Númenóreans was, like I said, to decline by that very intermingling that you got in places like Gondor, essentially acting as a general ennoblement of mankind to bring them back up to where they started, even if the Númenóreans themselves were lower?
An interesting question.
I would say I absolutely think that. Yeah, I think that what happened with Elrond and Elros, it left two lines of these half-elven, let's call them the ennobled Edain, were left, and I think that was part of the plan to have Elros's line And the other Dunedain they ruled over, because we know that not all the Dunedain were directly descended from Elros. But
Right.
But for the Dunedain to decline until they got to the point where those two lines came back together in Aragorn and Arwen to re-ennoble the human race, to basically create a new, more pure half-elven with their son Eldarion. So yeah, I think that was necessary, because I think that if the Númenóreans had just gone off to Númenor and just lived out the rest of the ages there, doing everything that they were supposed to and not breaking the ban of the Valar, I don't think that the circumstances would not have arisen for them to rejoin their line to Elrond's line. So I do think that fall was part of it, and maybe it's another case of something was going to happen to make them decline, and maybe the fall of Númenor, the following Sauron and the worship of Morgoth, maybe that hastened it. Maybe it would have been a slower decline had they not committed the acts that they did. But I definitely think that it was part of the plan, because I think that there's symmetry there to bring those two lines back together with Aragorn and Arwen's children, and then that becomes the line that will the line of ennobled men that will rule for the Fourth Age and beyond.
Mm-hmm. I totally, heartily concur. I do want to add that I love the reference to Spibimi, but I want to point that out for some of our newer listeners, since we haven't referenced that phrase in a while. That is an acronym, SPBMI, that goes all the way back to Ainulindale, and it's a reference to the line, shall prove but mine instrument. And it's when Eru speaks directly to Melkor, who has chosen to rebel, and he's telling him, look, it doesn't matter what you do, you're still going to prove to be my instrument in doing these amazing things. And that is just a reflection of Ilúvatar's ability to take even the evil things or bad things that are done by agents with free will and turn them and tweak them and adjust them into his plan so that the plan still reaches fruition. So that's what Spibimi is. And yeah, Maya, let me go ahead and bring you back on real quick.
Yeah, I agree with all of what you're saying, but I think you missed a portion of my question, because I'm less concerned with the fall of Númenor as much as the decline of the Númenóreans in Middle-earth, and not just the decline after the Lord of the Rings when they were reunited under Aragorn and Arwen, but the decline into modern times. Where did they go? And essentially what I'm thinking, and I mean, it's a continuation of that, but my theory is that if you look at them, maybe they declined in such a way that as they declined, the lower kindreds of men that maybe even were men of darkness, which we don't see anymore really, rose up and they met in the middle, and that purpose was to bring fallen man back as much as they could, like I said, through sort of general ennoblement. Then, of course, we know through Tolkien that the Númenóreans, in their most declined form, settled in England as the Anglo-Saxons. I personally think that maybe, seeing as this is something that Tolkien would have liked, this is entirely my speculation, that maybe you could extrapolate that someone like King Arthur was the last of their true blood. But my bigger point, is that do you think that in their decline through Spibimi, whether or not, or through what was already there, they brought everyone back to starting point and reset things, so that when the Dominion of Men began, we could begin it without all what the Men of Darkness represented?
Okay.
So begin it back at the level we were at before the first fall in the Tale of Adnil.
Yeah.
That's
kind
of
an
an
interesting
interesting
resetting.
thought.
That's an interesting theory. Certainly we know very little of that time frame. Tolkien leaves that very mysterious in terms of why they fell, how they fell, prior to their coming to the West. So we don't have a lot to go on there in terms of that status pre-fall. We don't know if maybe the ennoblement brought them back to that level per se, or maybe a little bit above or a little bit below. I tend to think of it as being, in terms of the ennoblement, as lifting them up even higher than they could have been without it. I mean, that is to say, even better
That's
than
how I see it
pre-fall
too.
man.
Yeah.
Because it's a combination of the two children of Ilúvatar. And that, is kind of represents the pinnacle, really, of the plan of Iluvatar, of this grand plan of bringing those two groups together, those two disparate groups, in order to ennoble men. Because really, at the end of the day, men are the ones that, I mean, they're the ones that don't fade.
Men are destined to inherit Arda.
Exactly.
Men are the ones who are going to carry Arda forward until the end of its
exactly.
story. The elves are leaving.
Elves fade. And even when it comes to the restoration or replacement, if you will, of Arda, we talk about the end prophecies and the destruction of the flawed Arda and the replacement of it with a new Arda. Mm-hmm. Literally, we don't know what happens to the elves. I mean, we can speculate that they get to come back in that time frame, but it's men that are going to do the work. So.
Mm-hmm. And Finrod seems to think they'll have a role to play.
I think they will. Yeah. It doesn't fit Iluvatar, at least from what Tolkien tells us of him. That the elves would just simply be, annihilated after the destruction of that.
I still believe even the dwarves will have a role to play. Because
I absolutely do. I mean, I kind of tend to think that when we get, and I think we've talked about this on the show, that whenever we get the some say, that, most often that's typically reflecting some sort of truth. And so the fact that the dwarves believe that Aule has, set things apart for him, that they've got separate halls in Mandos and that they have a job to do with him in rebuilding Arda. I tend to believe that that's a true statement. So,
I think going back to just one more thing I want to say about Maya's question, which is sort of carrying it forward. I do think we can imagine that as Aragorn's line continues and gets farther and farther away from the end of the Third Age, that bloodline is sort of distributed, that it's disseminated across more and more of men with each generation. And so probably that has the effect of, though the amount of Elvish blood in any ruler, in any line, the amount of Elvish blood would be less and less with each generation. But what that does is it has the effect of raising the horizontal line higher, so that the average man is at a higher point than they once were. And I think that's what you were saying a moment ago, Alan. And I think that's kind of how I see it too. I think it raises humankind as a race, sort of the baseline, the bell curve, whatever, is sort of raised a little higher than it would have been without the Edain and the Eldar ever intermingling.
Yeah, I would agree. We've got, and Maya, that is an excellent question. I know we will probably come back to you on a little bit on that, but I want to go ahead and move forward for now. Tim has asked to take the next question, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Tim.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. It's a little quiet, but we can adjust that.
Thank you. I'm wanting to reach out a little bit about the similarities between goblins and dwarves in the same vein that you see similarities between the orcs and the elves, in that in several of the letters, like in 131, he literally mentions goblins and orcs, and goblins being a paraphrasing of orcs, and later on they talk about the orcs and the goblins being both servants of the dark power that were created, or not created but corrupted rather, and it reminded me when I was thinking about the Underhill, Overhill chapter, and the fact that we're coming up on them going down the hole in the back of the cave. I remembered an old podcast from the Tolkien professor, like way back, like I think it's like 8 years ago, and he was comparing the dwarf songs and the goblin songs. How just like the dwarves, the goblins are underground crafting things, obviously much darker purposes. They both love the dark for their dark deeds, obviously with very different underlying purposes. And it just felt like, I've seen a lot of commentary in different places talking about the orcs being a corruption of elves, but no real mention, other than that one podcast really tying directly the dwarves to the goblins. But they seem, to me, to have that similar kind of vein, where where it seems very much like the goblins are a corruption of dwarves, or an attempt to try and imitate dwarves, I don't know if you ever thought of that, or is that something you could comment on?
I definitely have a few thoughts on that. Shawn, do you want to start out though? I've got.
Yeah, I can. I would like to, because one thing I will say first of all is in regards to goblins and orcs. I know by the time this actually hits the feed, folks will have already heard. Was it episode 59 where we covered the second half of Overhill and Underhill?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And we actually talked a bit at length about the terms goblins and orcs, but I think in regards to your question, Tim, about goblins versus dwarves and seeing the similarities between those two, as opposed to, as you said, we usually kind of look at orcs versus elves, and I think that's just because there's stuff in the Silmarillion about that, and there's things in the history of Middle Earth about that. Goblins versus dwarves is, or the similarities, I should say,
right.
Is something that I find, you mentioned Tolkien, Professor. I think Corey Olsen's book, Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, actually has a lot of good material about the similarities between the two, and sort of how goblins are an inversion of dwarves, in the fact that they do smith work, but they don't make any art. They make just, instruments for killing. And torture devices and things like that. Whereas we saw, even back in chapter 1 of The Hobbit, we saw the poem about all the beautiful things that dwarves created with their smith work. I think Corey Olsen talks about the fact that they both tend to live underground. They're both creatures of darkness of kind of different ways. But obviously there's slightly different spins on that. So yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of similarities that are there that I don't think I've really made a full study of, but I think Corey Olsen's got some interesting stuff on it. I think another thing that I think is interesting is the fact that both of them are, at least in certain versions of the Legendarium, associated with stone. So I mean, obviously the dwarves and stone kind of go hand in hand, and Aule being sort of exactly, Aule being sort of the earth elemental Vala.
Yeah.
But early on, Tolkien actually had written that the orcs or goblins had their origins in stone as well, and we even see in some of the early places. I think once in the Lay of Lathian, and actually even once in the Hobbit, they're described as stony. I think in one place it's stony voices, and another place it's stony feet. And so I definitely think that they're both sort of earth-based, or if you want to use the fancy academic word, chthonic creatures in that way.
Oh my goodness!
Being of the earth.
Okay, put your word nerd away, Shawn.
Had to get that in there.
Good heavens, man!
But they're both creatures of the earth,
Yeah.
And so I think that there is that. I think we could probably plumb those depths, to use a really, really awful pun.
That's a really bad wordplay right there.
And there's probably a lot more similarities that can be found. I don't know, Alan, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, the first thing that came to my mind was when Aule made the dwarves. He wasn't at that time trying to make something radically different from the other children of Iluvatar. He didn't know. If we go to the beginning of chapter 2, Aule made the dwarves, even as they still are, because the forms of the children who were to come were unclear to his mind. And then Melkor was strong, so he wanted them to be strong and unyielding. So I think, you may be hitting on something. We know that the orcs are sort of a mockery of the elves in some ways, but aren't the dwarves almost made, not so much a mockery, because that was not Aule's purpose, but aren't they made as a blind copy, if you will? Aule wanted to make children like the children were going to be. He just didn't know what shape they would take, so he gave them the shape of the dwarves, because apparently he makes very ugly things. But I would think that's got something to do with it a little bit. And then, of course, Aule being, as Shawn said, this kind of earth elemental, that it's not a surprise then that the goblins similarly have that same predilection.
It's interesting to think of them both as creatures that were not part of Iluvatar's plan, that were created with or sub-created or whatever, bred with very different motivations. Aule and Melkor's motivations could not be farther apart, but how they are both similar in that way. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it really is. That is a good question. Let's see. I think Sharat is next, and then Dime. So, Sharat, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you here. All right, there you are.
So I guess I want to throw you guys a softball because you've had a couple tough ones. But as I've been reading through the annotated Hobbit, I've found a couple of really fun facts. And just pick a couple. In the first chapter, I think Douglas Anderson follows some research that Tom Shippey had done and found out that Baggins comes from or he speculates that Baggins comes from this northern dialect word for a meal between meals.
Oh, yes, I recall that.
That's right, yeah.
And also that in the first edition, I think it might be in the description of hobbits, but Tolkien references the Lilliputians. And that was really interesting to me because he obviously slightingly refers to Gulliver's Travels on fairy stories.
Exactly, as being one of the world-traveling... Yeah, it's not fantasy. It's not a fairy story because of that. Yeah,
exactly. So I guess I was wondering what fun facts have you guys maybe learned from the annotated Hobbit?
We've had a lot, haven't we? That's been one of our favorite little resources.
The annotated Hobbit has been a great resource for us.
Oh, goodness. I think the reviews were some of the most eye-opening things for me. And again, reading it maybe in the introduction, I think, when we were going through that, just seeing all the foresight for some and the total blindness of others. It was really, really fascinating read. Seeing people early on catch things like the Norse myths and, those tie-ins, really kind of bringing in that northern feel. And, of course, C.S. Lewis's wonderful reviews. That was something I enjoyed very much. And then we just talked about this, I think, in the episode that recently aired about the rocks in coming down the glacier in Switzerland.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was there in the annotated Hobbit as well. Though I think that's in one of the letters, but I'm struggling to recall exactly where that was. I may read very, very, very many things, but I don't remember where I read them. Shawn, what about you?
because you read so much, Alan, that sometimes it's hard to remember where something came from.
Exactly. When you know so many things, you don't always remember the source of that knowledge.
Right. For me, I would say the thing that's coming to mind right now, because I had the foresight to bring my annotated Hobbit up to my booth, but I didn't have the foresight to actually bring it into my booth, so it's sitting outside, and now I'm talking, so it's too late to go get it. But I think the thing that's coming to mind for me is hearing of a book I'd never heard of before that was an inspiration for The Hobbit, which was The Marvelous Land of Snurgs by Edward White Smith. It's a book that I have not heard of before, and I've not read it. I haven't gone out and actually tried to pick it up and read it yet. But it is a book that Tolkien was apparently influenced by, and that's been fascinating to me because as much as I may say things like, don't go looking for the bones, just enjoy the soup that's before us, because I do love that quote and I think it is very important. But I am
very apropos.
If you haven't noticed this over the last 59 episodes, I am a notorious bone hunter. And I love, I love old mythologies. I love medieval literature. I love even 19th century literature, even some of the stuff that, Tolkien probably turned his nose up at. I love. And so I just love to see all those different things that influence Tolkien in different ways. I've gone back and I've reread Alice in Wonderland recently just because we've been talking about it so much. I love like The Wind in the Willows, and I know that was one of Tolkien's favorite books. I want to go and read some of those authors I've been learning about recently, Lord Dunsany and George MacDonald and things like that. But this was another one of those, so it's kind of like it's just sort of gone into my little file of things that I want to learn more about, because this was a children's story about these strange creatures called Snurgs that Tolkien said he read and he liked, and I don't know. That's the one that's coming to mind right now.
Very cool.
Fun fact.
That's a cool question, Shrut. Thank you for an easy one. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, I believe it's D-May's turn next, so why don't we go ahead and unmute?
My question is actually going to be another slow pitch, but it's one that I get asked frequently while I teach The Hobbit. And, kids, they're not nice. They want the answer now.
They do.
I have never been able to answer this, and it's kind of follows along on a previous question about the dwarves and the goblins. Okay, so they're in Goblin Town, and the Great Goblin gets shown Orcrist. Mm-hmm. Everybody recognizes it. Come on. Yeah. What is up with that? Do they keep a diary of swords I have known and hated?
That is a good question.
And, I don't have an answer. Usually I kind of, joke around with the kids until they forget their question. But if you guys have an insight that I could share, because I'm going to be teaching that chapter probably in about another 3 weeks, and it'd be nice to have somebody else's response.
Well, I think we have something. Let me go ahead and put you back on mute while we talk about it. Shawn, we actually, it's interesting. This is episode 60, but and we're recording it before episode 59 airs. But in 59, we actually touch on that, don't we?
We did, I believe. Yeah, I think we determined that it was proof that the goblins must have told stories, right?
They must have some sort of a culture, an oral history type of thing.
They have some sort of recorded history, so they know the story. Obviously, they have their own name for it, which I love. Biter, being this really gross, imprecise, gross in sort of rough, crude, imprecise translation of Orcrist, Goblin Cleaver.
Well, like you said, I think in the episode you said it was an imprecise word for an imprecise people.
I think I did say that. Sounds like something I would say.
It does sound like something I'd say. Very, erudite.
Thank you. I try. So I think there's definitely proof that they had told some stories about it. They had some history. As for how they actually recognized it, maybe those books were illustrated.
Well, I actually have a hard time believing they had a written history, of course, but I do think that an oral history, and, they'd be described in terms of their glowing blue. There wouldn't be very many blades still around in the Third Age that would have escaped Gondolin's fall. And so it may be that these are really the only ones out there, and they are known through the goblin community by their glowing blue light, their terrifying glowing blue light. Keep in mind, though, they also recognized Thorin. They didn't just recognize his sword. The great goblin basically wants to know all about them, and then he says, but, I already know about you, Thorin Oakenshield. So there's clearly more of a culture than we might have expected from the goblins. Mm-hmm. That makes sense, given they're even a poetic people, even if the poem is, rather blunt.
Not the loveliest thing.
No, exactly. What did we just decide that it's it's right below Vogon poetry? It's only the fourth worst poetry in the known universe.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that there's enough history there, and it makes sense. I mean, even a primitive culture is going to have a history that describes, their wars, their historical events, in broad brush terms. Certainly swords this dramatic, swords that have this kind of presence. It makes sense to me that they would actually have had that in their stories, in their songs.
That is true. I guess
something they tell little goblins: be careful, or Biter will come and get you.
Oh, sure, sure. It is interesting that they knew that it was Biter and not Beater.
That's true.
Because
are they different sizes? I mean, is Orcrist a slightly smaller sword, perhaps, than Glamdring?
I don't know. Peter
Jackson
I'm
thinking
made it
curved. A one hand. No, probably not curved, but I'm thinking like a one-handed sword versus a bastard sword or something.
I don't know.
Pardon my French. That's an actual weapon.
No, yeah. I don't know that we get that much information about it, but it is interesting that they were able to figure out not only that it was a sword of Gondolin, but that they knew exactly which one it was. And as Maya's just pointed out in the chat, all the swords of Gondolin, as far as we knew, glowed blue.
Mm-hmm. But these may be the only ones that escaped. That's quite possible.
So I mean, I guess you would. I can see how they knew it was a blade of Gondolin, but how did they know it was Orcrist?
Biter versus Beater.
Maybe there was something about it, something really distinctive about it.
We're not told, but it would make sense that maybe one is a larger blade.
Particular kind of jewels on. Well, it had the jeweled pommel, didn't it? Wasn't Orcrist the one with the jeweled pommel?
I believe so. That's right, because we were wondering who it might have belonged to in Gondolin.
Right.
And the jewels told us that it might have belonged to Ecthelion, if I remember correctly.
It could have been that. I mean, there could have just been something distinctive about it as opposed to Glomdring and others. It
Right.
would have been, since it was the mate of Glomdring, and Glomdring belonged to the king, even though we don't know who Orcus belonged to. I think we speculated that it was Ecthelion. But regardless, it would have been one of the fanciest that was there.
Yeah, certainly. I'm thinking that they're just really the last ones still remaining. So, even though they might have ancient stories of an entire army equipped with blue swords, at the fall of Gondolin when, the entire city is, filled with a blue, eerie light. Here, these may be the only ones that survived into the Third Age. I know that's speculation, but that's the only thing I can think of. D-May, does that answer your question in any way, shape, or form?
That helps. It gives me some more diversionary tactics.
That may be all that suffices.
I think the Great Goblin took one look at it. He said, blue blade, and it's covered with bling. This is Biter.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Something along those lines. I get a kick out of the fact that they recognize Thorin right away.
Yeah.
I think I remember speculating that perhaps they didn't recognize him on sight. They just recognized it when he started being all haughty and talking too much. So,
well, he was a dwarf of importance.
Yes, right. Of quite a bit of importance at that. That was an excellent question, and we are glad that we could help you a little bit, even if it only buys you a couple minutes of the little ones. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Glad to help.
All right. Let's see. Do we have, before we start circling around and asking for second questions, Lee, what do you have for us? Are you able to hear us this time? Oh, maybe not. Lee, can you hear me? All right. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and type to him in the chat. But Lee did ask a question in chat earlier when we were having problems with audio. Let's see if I can find that question. He said, in case I'm locked out, my first easy style question that's easy will be, who is your favorite villain in the Legendarium?
Ooh, who is your favorite villain in the Legendarium?
Can you take that while I try to type and see if I can get him back into the audio?
Yeah. I don't think this is going to surprise anybody. I'm going to say Feanor. And I say favorite because he's so well written. He's such a strongly written character. He's more, I wouldn't say he's morally ambiguous. The more you read it, I think the less morally ambiguous he is. But he is at least human enough that that the first few times you read it, he does come across as a hero. It is possible to read him as a hero. And obviously, we get a lot of mail about that. So,
just a little.
So I think that's the one. I think he's the one that I look at that I say, well, that is just an incredibly well written character. And he's such a fun villain. He's such a fun villain to think about and to speculate about, and so important to the story as a whole.
Mm-hmm. That crucial, central to that entire first age.
Yeah. So, I think it's Feanor for me.
Yeah, that's I mean, he's certainly my favorite villain to beat up. I mean, there's no doubting that. As much as I give all sorts of grief to Melkor Morgoth and Sauron and Saruman and Ar-Pharazôn and Eol and all sorts of other fun stuff. I probably would have said Feanor had Shawn not taken that answer. I'm
sorry.
No, it's okay.
I should have known that would have been yours.
No, it's okay. We could both make him our favorite, but I have to say there's really something about Ar-Pharazôn that just gets me as a villain. I mean, he's so... There's this tragic downfall in the sense that he comes under the influence of Sauron, but he only comes under the influence of Sauron because of his own pride in the first place. Mm-hmm. And he allows himself to become this puppet, and he almost realizes it. I mean, that moment after they've landed on the shores of Aman, and he has that hesitation, and he thinks, maybe I shouldn't do this. Mm-hmm. You're like, that's the last bit of good sense he had, and it had been buried for too long.
Mm-hmm. It was that sudden moment of clarity. It's like if I don't think Tolkien uses the word besotted in reference to Ar-Pharazôn specifically, but if he was besotted with Sauron's words, that was the moment where he suddenly sobered up for a moment and said, wait, am I really going to do this?
Wait, am I? Is this a good idea?
But he had just come too far. He his pride had mastered him at that point.
I agree. Well, I'm getting something from Lee in text. He's unfortunately having some technical difficulties, so he is going to ask us one more question. So we'll hem and haw a little bit more on villains while we wait for him to finish typing that question. In the meantime, I have to go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm trying to think through if there's a favorite villain that I have who's not one of the more the more relatable villains, like the more the obvious villains, the Dark Lords and things like that.
Morgoth kind of big one right there.
I mean,
at that level, I'd have to say somebody like maybe Denethor. I mean, I know he's not a classic villain in that sense, but there's something villainous about him.
Oh yeah,
and he's not one of those big headliner villains, but boy, his actions, sure do cost a lot.
Yeah,
I mean, his actions directly led to the death of Theoden.
Mm-hmm.
That's sad.
Yeah.
And it's enough to make me really, really angry at the guy.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess if I had one more, I would probably have to say Lotho.
Oh yeah.
Just because
he's a good one. Lotho Sackville Baggins.
He's another one who he comes back in so late in the story, and you could almost write him off. But but he's such a great example of the corruptive power that evil has in Middle Earth and in our Earth. He's a guy who's just been lied to. He's been seduced by Saruman, and he betrays his own people. But as and somebody just said in the chat, and I can't remember, and I can't scroll up right now. No villain thinks of themselves as the villain.
That's true.
And when you see a character like Lotho,
we've observed that. Even the orcs think they're the heroes in their own story, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you look at somebody like Lotho, and you can probably think through how he probably thought in some way he was doing something good for the Shire.
Right.
Maybe not. I don't know.
These backwards people, they need somebody to bring them into the whatever century.
I'm civilizing them. I'm modernizing them. That's probably the way Tolkien would think of it.
Oh, yeah. That's absolutely how Tolkien would have thought of it. And along with his entire, distaste for modernism.
Yeah. But he's such a great villain because he's so petty and he's so small-minded. He's so parochial, just like the Shire.
Parochial. That is an excellent word. And it really is. It does.
I think you used it recently. Entirely. I think that's where I got it.
I think so. I think that's why I think it's an excellent word.
So there's a lot of good ones, though. I mean,
there are.
As interesting as Morgoth is,
he's the obvious answer, but he's not my favorite.
Right. No, because the ones that are my favorites are the ones that have some complexity, the ones that are kind of fun to sink into.
Yeah. I mean, even Eöl, just as little as we get of him is at least fascinating.
Yeah.
Total creep, but
yeah. Yeah.
Nothing compared to his son.
True.
All right. Let's see here. So now Lee is wrapping this up, and here's his question before he leaves. And then it looks like we'll be able to kind of wrap it around and start offering folks a second bite at the apple. Lee asks a question that I'm sure a lot of people have asked, and I don't know that we have an answer to, is where can I find more on the Entwives? I see the loss of the Entwives and the lack of memory that Treebeard has of his past history as similar to the subtle passing of the dwarves. Ents are sub-created, as the dwarves are. Is this punishment for not having the 100% Eru seal of approval? My goodness, that is, and as he points out, Yavanna was prideful. She never repents. She only asserts for protection of her peace to the music. Noble, but still a somewhat Melkor-like trait. That's some really good insight.
It is, and I definitely see something Melkor-like about her. I think, as I said way back in episode.
Oh yeah,
8?
Like 6 or something, or 8. Yeah,
it was way
8,
back.
You're right.
The thing that strikes me about Yavanna versus Aule in Chapter 2 of this. Chapter 2? Yeah, Chapter 2 of the Silmarillion is the fact that Aule goes off and creates his children in secret. Yavanna goes through the established authority. She goes to Manwë, and she appeals to Manwë.
One might say whines to Manwë, but still.
Yeah, but she goes to him, and
she does it through the established channels.
She goes through the chain of command.
Exactly.
And ultimately, when Manwë says, no, I'm not really sure about that, she says, well, it was in the music. So check the record, run that back and listen to that again. Because it was there, and I think she's right there. So while she is prideful, I don't think that she acts on her pride in the way that even Aule does.
That's a good point. I mean, she doesn't really have as much to repent of.
That's the way I see it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, she didn't really do a wrong thing.
She didn't act on well, she did. She acted through the appropriate authority, as
Right,
opposed to
that's the thing. Because she
Owly,
went
who
through
had
those
this
right
idea
channels.
and decided to go off in secret. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, sure, she definitely had pride in it, no question. She had pride in her
Definitely,
part of the
absolutely,
creation. But because she didn't do it, in secret and against Iluvatar's wishes, there's really nothing for her to repent of.
At least in terms of action.
Right. But it's an interesting question. I mean, where he's trying to get at is, not quite having the 100%. They're not really children of Iluvatar, right? I mean, the Ents are certainly sentient beings. They're inhabited by spirits. Again, we don't know of what
We don't know
level
the
or
nature
type.
of those spirits, right?
But we do know that they were in the music, subcreated, if you will, by Yavanna and by Yavanna alone. I think Manwë was involved with the Eagles.
Right.
So, they're not children, just like the dwarves aren't children. But I don't know that I could draw enough of a similarity between those two in that regard. I mean,
Yeah.
if that's the case, then you'd also have to put the Eagles in the same category as the Ents.
Yeah. Well, and
they
there's
certainly
a
seem to-
tendency for people, and we've done this in the past too, and I've kind of changed my mind on it a little bit. There's a tendency to say, well, if it must be a Maya, and if there's a
Right.
spirit in it, it must be a Maya. And I think I kind of came to it from that perspective a little bit when we first started the podcast, but over time,
I did too.
I think over time we've talked more and more about it, and I think there may be other things out there.
Yeah,
and
they're
there may be
not
things that
categorized.
we just don't know about. They're just not written about in the Silmarillion.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're not categorized.
identified. We don't know. So
Right.
there's some additional category. I mean,
Right.
some probably still are. I mean, I certainly look at somebody like Glaurung, and I've got to think Maya, or somebody like Ungoliant.
Yeah,
I'd have
I
to
think
Maya.
some of them definitely are. Some of the more powerful ones.
Yeah. Karkaroth.
Yeah.
But to answer his first
back to
question
the question,
first,
I
which I
guess.
guess we should have done, which is where can I find more on the Entwives, and the answer is you can't. I mean, really,
There's nothing.
There's really nothing. He's asked that question a little bit in a few letters. So if you want to search the letters, you'll find a few references. But basically what you'll find is that he doesn't have anything on them. He doesn't have a conclusion to their story. He doesn't have an answer, because people, of course, have always wanted to know where are the Entwives. It's a very sad story. Certainly, I would not say that Middle-earth Shadow of War gives you an answer. The things that does to canon are just... Anyway, I don't want to go there.
I still haven't played that.
Yeah, okay, it's a mildly fun orc killing simulator, but let's just leave it at that and say that it has nothing at all whatsoever to do with Tolkien's Middle-earth. I mean,
Gotcha.
nothing.
Well, and I think the truth is that Tolkien didn't really have anything on the Entwives because he didn't really know. I mean, as we talked about was it episode 58? I think it was 58. When we talked about how Treebeard, when he first came on the scene during the composition of Two Towers, Treebeard was at first maybe just a friendly giant.
Right.
Apologies to Roald Dahl.
Ho, ho, ho.
Or that
Green
Jolly
giant.
Green Giant. But I don't think Tolkien really had done much with the Ents in his mythology or with the Entwives, and I think he just kind of wrote in the detail about the Entwives
Exactly.
as kind of a mystery that he probably didn't even have an answer to.
Right. Well, and he liked mysteries, and he liked to
did.
leave them that way.
He did, yeah.
So,
He wanted there to be some enigmas, and obviously,
yeah. And certainly the
few of those.
Entwives are one of them. They really are. It's an interesting analogy, though. He talks about kind of the similarity between Ents and Entwives as this passing of the dwarves. I'm not sure. I guess maybe he's talking about, and it's hard to ask because he's not able to hear us. So I'm assuming maybe sort of the way they have become a culture in diaspora. They're not able to really rebuild the way that they would otherwise. I don't know. I don't see. I'm not sure I see the connection there, but it is that they are subcreated, and that's his point. I don't know that I'd say there's any sort of punishment there. I think with the Entwives, it was a matter of, they went their own separate ways. I mean, you could say it's a lack of wisdom on one part or the other. You could certainly try to pin blame on one side or the other, but in reality, they went and did what they wanted to do, and it seems that most likely they probably perished on the Daggerlad Plains. So,
I've seen some theories, though, some interesting theories.
yeah. Oh yeah, there are very interesting theories.
Wasn't there a theory that we saw somewhere that somebody thought that maybe the Entwives had been corrupted into trolls?
Ooh,
I don't know where that came from.
That's creepy. Yeah, that's right. That's right. I remember saying that's where the Entwives went. Maybe
did we talk
Somebody
about that?
Was talking. Yeah, about how they were.
Where did I hear that? Was that one of us? I have no idea.
It was one of us. Yes, I think we were talking about how the trolls were made in mockery of Ents, and we wondered if they were bred like the orcs were from elves. And I suggested, well, maybe that's where the Entwives went.
Maybe that was it. Okay.
That was very tongue-in-cheek. I certainly wasn't being serious. It's a pretty scary thought, but it is possible.
And I've even heard about maybe the Old Forest is where they ended up. That's a theory I've actually heard of.
Yeah, that seems to make a little bit more sense. Yeah. But maybe it's really not Old Man Willow. Maybe we're just making an assumption there. But it seems that my comment about Middle-earth Shadow of War has prompted some comments in the chat room. I think we're going to leave that alone. Okay, so we're probably at about the hour mark, so we certainly can't go back and have long, difficult questions from everybody. But if anybody's got a short or easy or simple or fun question, Maya, all right, let me go ahead and unmute you, Maya. Go ahead.
Yeah, this one might not be entirely it's not the simplest, but it'll probably be pretty quick. Okay. So I've been thinking about this for a while. If you go back into the Silmarillion and look at it from a thematic level, and by this I mean both in-world, but also as far as what Tolkien was relating to when he wrote it, and you look at the Elfrens, and I do not mean like the kindreds of the Edain, but like the individuals, like when Turin, like that. It seems to me that they're playing two separate roles as far as how Tolkien is writing them. It's like in the First Age mythology, that's precisely what they are. Is they're playing like the role of mythological heroes, like you could correspond someone like Huron to being like Odysseus or that type of a hero in that mythological sense. But also it seems like looking back at it from the First Age, especially when you consider like Elrond's reference to Frodo being seated amongst the Elfrens, is like there's also an element where, in addition to being mythological heroes, historically maybe they also have like the role of the saints in various Christian denominations.
Interesting.
I don't know. Let's discuss that. Shawn, what are your thoughts?
Well, that is a tough one.
That is a tough one. I don't know.
I mean,
he did try to avoid that sort of explicit reference. I mean, he tried to avoid one-to-one kind of allegorical relations between, his characters and religious figures, with the exception of Eru.
Right.
One would say. I don't know. That's a very good question.
I mean, definitely I definitely see the mythological aspect that you talked about in the first stage.
Oh, yeah, that's a given.
That I think is pretty clear. The role they're playing by the Third Age maybe is a little bit more challenging. But when you look at something like a sort of a semi-literate culture, like a medieval culture, or even an ancient culture, you've got people walking around that claim descent from gods and heroes and things like that. I mean, they're the kings of England at some point, and I don't know exactly when, but at some point the kings of England started claiming descent from King Arthur. At some point, well, certainly if you go back to ancient Greece, there were numerous kings and things like that of different city-states that would claim descent from actual specific gods and so forth. So maybe it's Tolkien's sort of bringing that concept into Middle-earth, the fact that there are people who are around today who are living, breathing people who are either descended from these heroic elf friends of old or part of that, or sort of a carrying on of that tradition. Maybe bringing new people into that tradition. Somebody like Frodo or Bilbo is now brought into that tradition, even though they didn't have ancestors in that tradition. I don't know what to make of that.
It becomes an identity of merit rather than of blood.
Yeah.
Right.
And I don't know if there is something there that's sort of akin to, like the canonization or the beatification of saints in the Catholic tradition. I don't know if Tolkien was thinking of anything like that.
That's true. I don't know.
But I definitely think that there's an idea there of sort of an elite circle of people who either by merit or descent, as you put it, Alan, I think are in that group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and and I certainly, if you come to it from that perspective, I think you could, we've talked about allegory versus applicability. You could certainly apply it like that. You could interpret it that way. You could look at that and say, oh, this is sort of like that, and without assuming that it's what Tolkien intended. You could certainly take it that way without without falling too far afield, I think. Tim, looks like Tim's got a question. Let me unmute you there. All right, fire away.
I just wanted to comment that I remember when I very first started reading as a kid, I would blow through the poems and go on to the next line in the story. And then
I'm not the only one.
And then when I got a little bit older, I encountered poetry in school, and one of the teachers talked to me about Poe and why his poetry was so beautiful. And he said you'd find it out for yourself just by reading it out loud. And all of a sudden I found that there's a sense of, when you read it, you find sort of the meter and the flow. And I found later on, when I came back to other poetry, like in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, all of a sudden I would read it out loud and it just came alive. You think like the Goblin song, it just you get a feel for these aggressive, rude, horrible beings, and it comes alive in a way that before I'd read it on the page and look kind of silly.
Yeah. Same with even the tra-la-la-lally elves that I so frequently mock.
I guess I'd just love to hear your opinion on the poetry and how you've approached it and how it spoke to you.
Yeah, that's a good taking off point. Shawn, why don't you jump in first?
Well, I was probably one of the few who always read the poems from the very beginning, because I've been a fan of poetry for a long time. Even in high school, which is when I first read Lord of the Rings, I was reading things like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Edgar Allan Poe, and even reading translations of things like the Odyssey and stuff in poetry. So I was okay with it. I do agree that it totally comes off the page when you read it aloud. I would actually argue that even Tolkien's prose really comes off the page when you read it aloud.
Especially when you get into some of those more unique segments. We've talked about that paratactical syntax. Ooh, man. Reading those battle passages out loud.
Yeah.
Gets the blood pumping.
Oh, yeah, it really does. So I think, Tolkien is just one of those authors that I just love reading aloud anytime, anywhere, as my family knows and is probably sick of.
Mine too.
But no, I love the poetry. I love the fact that Tolkien has brought poetry into that world, and I love the fact that he's introduced the idea of storytelling through poetry to a generation of readers who probably don't know that much about it. If you grew up in the 20th century, the 21st century, maybe your first exposure to poetry is, if you're lucky, is probably more like lyric poetry and things like that are just sort of kind of these little mood pieces, describing feelings and emotions as opposed to telling a story. And when you first realize that poetry can tell a story,
oh man,
wow. The amazing things that you can do in telling a story in poetry, and the way the music of the poetry can translate to action in the story, or I guess the other way around. The action in the story can be described in music and the poetry, and I think that just kind of opens your mind to really other types of poetry and the history of poetry, and so I love it. I don't know if that answers the question at all, Tim, but I love it, and I think it's a vital part of Tolkien's world that I think is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, it really is, and I'm not like Shawn. I didn't read the poetry when I was young. Tim, I was more like you. I typically skipped it, but yeah, once I started reading it out loud, and for me, I think that happened when I was maybe a little older. I think I was 19 or 20 when I started, paying a little more attention to the poetry because I was reading the book out loud. And my goodness, that just changed everything. I pulled up. It did the same thing for me with the Elven tongue. With some of the words from the Elvish languages. I absolutely, one of the highlights of my entire podcasting career here was when we did Tolkien Reading Day, and I got to read I laurie lantarlassi surnen, yeniunotume verammaralderon. I mean, there's something so breathtakingly cool about that piece. And it all of a sudden it just rolls and you get it. Even if you don't really understand it, as you're reading. It's musical in a way
that you don't comprehend it. Yeah, you just kind of feel it in your gut. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I just now except for the Tra-la-la-lally elves, I love reading the poetry.
But even that one, just the unbridled joy in that one. If you read it aloud, as I did in our episode on that chapter, I was kind of not sure, like, should I really get into the ha-ha part at the end, or should I kind of play it a little
hilarious,
more deadpan? I found like if you just get into it, you just inhabit it, and that's the best way to do it, is just to kind of Tolkien said in one of his letters, and I don't have it in front of me, but he described his poetry as being indicative of the characters and the races who created it. He said, this poetry isn't meant to be the poor old professor's emotions or the poor old professor's thoughts and words. This is supposed to be describing a race or a particular character, and I think he does that so well. And I think when you read it aloud, you get a sense for things like the brutality of the orcs, or the just unbridled joy of the elves, or the
sorrow of the elves, even for that matter.
They
feel so much more deeply than men, it seems. Both their sorrow and their joy are much more sorrowful and joyful than our own sorrow and joy. I remember when we did that episode on the poetry in March, I think my look at it was looking at the poetry of different races. And you're right, there's such a drastically different and unique individualistic feel to each one. And even among the men, you had a different feel for the men of Gondor versus like the songs from Dale.
Yeah.
Not that we had a lot to choose from there, but anyway.
No.
Certainly
one of the amazing things about that is just how much the poetry of men is used to record lore and prophecy.
History.
I think we picked up on that in it was the Lake Town poem, which I'm actually interested. I can't wait to get to when we get to it. But
that's going to be fun.
Because I have some new thoughts on that one. But
that's going to be good. Well, in the meantime, Sharat has another question for us. Go ahead.
All right. So this is actually a callback to Lee's question about villains. And
good.
You and Shawn had brought up the idea that no villain really thinks of themselves as evil. There's a moment in Lord of the Rings in Two Towers when Sam sees the dead Harad soldier and wonders whether he was really evil of heart. The quote here, I have it. It's, if he was really evil of heart, or what lies or threats had led him on the long march from his home.
Yeah. I think that's the line they gave to Faramir in the movie.
Yeah, they did.
And I wonder whether you all think, you were talking about how, obviously when you read it, you can't think of Feanor as an anti-hero or something, or Morgoth, but whether in the text that's given to us, there's any justification for reading the Haradrim or the Southrons sympathetically, or whether our sympathies should entirely lie with Gondor and with the heroes of the story that's being told to us.
That is an excellent question.
I would say I think the fact that Tolkien wrote that line, I think tells us that he wants us to remember that the Haradrim are not, they're not evil to a man. They're following orders.
Their leaders may be.
Their leaders may be. Their leaders have probably forced them. Well, certainly forced them to do this, and maybe their leaders are in league with Sauron. Maybe their leaders are truly evil, or maybe their leaders are just lied to, or maybe their leaders are, coerced in some way. We don't know, but I think that Tolkien does want us to have that moment of doubt. He wants us to sympathize with them for a moment. It's a reminder that they are men. They're not orcs.
Exactly, and I think I really don't mean to cut you off, but it really made me think of this being one of those moments where Tolkien's real world experience comes into play.
Absolutely, yeah. If you didn't get to it, I was going to.
Exactly. I mean, here's a man who fought in World War I at the Battle of the Somme, who knew that these were men on the other side of no man's land, 100 yards away in that trench. That these were Germans, but that a lot of them were just 19-year-old boys, no different than he is, and that they weren't there because they wanted to kill every French or British soldier. They were there because they had to be. And I think there's a certain element of, let's not forget that even in war, we're still fighting our own people. We're still fighting people. And it's an unfortunate reality, but we need to keep in mind that humanity and have empathy for them. Yeah.
Well, and I think Tolkien would have been uniquely positioned to have that observation in World War I because unlike a lot of the men who were fighting by his side, he actually traced his family to German roots.
Yeah.
He
even though I think we've learned recently that he's probably wrong.
That's been brought into question recently by some of some really awesome work that's being done by a scholar in Poland. But going into that war, Tolkien thought of his family as a German family. Tolkien was already interested in Germanic languages and Germanic mythology, and he knew his history well enough to know the connections between the Anglo-Saxons of his country and Germany. He certainly would have known that these, had things gone a little bit differently in history, these people could have been fighting side by side as opposed to fighting against each other. So
that's right.
I definitely think that influenced his perspective on war in general, and I definitely think it influenced that passage in Two Towers. And I would just kind of reiterate what I said a moment ago, is that these are men. These are not orcs. These are men, and I think we are meant to have some sympathy for them because they're only on that side of the battle because of where they were born, basically.
Agreed. Daniel has a question for us. Let me unmute you. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, I actually have two questions. One is like tiny, like yes or no, and the other one is short. So I was looking for books at the bookstore, and I saw the Beren and Luthien novel. And I opened it up, and I saw quite a bit of the Lay of Leithian inside. Is the entire Lay of Leithian inside?
No.
Oh, okay. No. Well,
a lot
Lots of it, though.
Yeah, a lot of it is.
Lots of it.
Okay.
Not the entire thing.
It is not a novelization like Children of Húrin is. It is a collection of various stages of the Beren and Luthien tale as told in different versions of the story. So you will get chunks of the earliest versions, chunks of the Lay of Leithian, and chunks from the version of the Silmarillion. It's to show the development of different elements of the story, but there is no, unlike Children of Húrin, there's no new material published in that book. It's still well worth it, if no other reason than Alan Lee's art. You're never going to see a picture of Tevildo like you do in this copy of Beren and Luthien. But yeah, it's not the entirety of the Lay of Leithian. So
okay.
But what it is, and what I think is really wonderful about it, is that it is because of the way it's arranged. You'll get a passage from the Lay of Leithian, followed by a passage from oh gosh, what was the
I know
the later Quenta, what eventually became the Silmarillion, but like sort of maybe a draft or two earlier than that. Yeah. So you can you get a chance to compare the poetic with the prose version.
Yeah. Okay. It's definitely worth that. So what was your second question?
Yeah, so in The Hobbit, I see a lot of references to Gondolin, and I haven't actually made it through more than half the book, well, except for a long time ago. But I haven't seen any other references to any of the other old stuff. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Like nothing to Beleriand or Doriath or Menegroth or anything like that, right? There are a number of references. I think using my handy ebook search, there's 6 references to Gondolin. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Shawn, one of the main reasons for that is that was the story that at that point, that was the first stage story that was the most developed for Tolkien. He had written that first, The Fall of Gondolin, and I think he had that in his mind more fully formed than the other tales. Keep in mind, we do get other references. I mean, if you go back to the first edition, which of course, we only have in the facsimile edition, but we talked about this not that long ago, where he referenced, with referencing the necromancer, he talked about
Beren and Luthien.
and
Did
how
that make
they
it
had.
into the first edition, or was it just in an earlier draft?
Oh, you're right. That was just a draft. My mistake.
But still,
I think it was.
That's a point that I was going to make, was that he was going to make some explicit references
Yeah.
to Beren and Luthien, because
Yeah.
even at that phase, he was thinking of the necromancer as being Thu from that
As being
story,
Thu.
who
That's
became
true.
Sauron.
So, I mean, he had
but
those
what else
stories
was
in
there?
his mind, but it seems like Gondolin was the one that was the most fully formed, so it makes sense that that was the one that that made it in.
There's a reference to Thingol in there, or what appears to be Thingol. Though
yes,
at the time
with
when he was
the Elven King.
Right, he talks about the ancient war between the dwarves and the elves. Where basically he's describing the story of the Nauglamir.
Right.
But there's at the time, I think Ratliff speculated that at the time Tolkien wasn't quite sure if he was going to make the Elven King actually Thingol, or make him somebody else, who eventually became Thranduil. But I still think if you take it in context with the rest of the Legendarium, I think that becomes a pretty clear reference to Thingol.
It definitely does.
And what else is there? I think there's a reference to the three kindreds of elves going across the sea.
Yeah, exactly. We've got the light elves, the deep elves, and the sea elves. So that's going to be your OMG Manwë and your Noldor and your Teleri.
Right.
Sorry, I forgot the Vanyar's name for just a brief moment and referenced them by our all too frequent
That's what they get for going over and never coming back.
Seriously. Oh, goodness. Good question, though. Good question. All right. Does anybody else have one more? Looks like it. Yeah, Sharon, hold on a moment. Let me unmute you. Fire away.
All right. So following up on the question about Gondolin, I was actually wondering when I was listening to your last episode, or maybe it was 2 episodes ago now, you were talking about the theory that Glamdring and Orcrist might have been, swords wielded by Torgon and Ecthelion.
Yeah.
But when I've sat in on Dr. Olson's classes, he's often mentioned that the mentions of Gondolin or the Elven King or other things to other parts of the Legendarium aren't fully integrated, and so he said there are inconsistencies. Do you know what he's referring to there, or I guess that's my question.
That's a good question. I don't know about inconsistencies as much as incompletions. I mean, that's where I go with it.
I think of one thing that that Professor Olson told us when we talked to him back in episode 52, when we were talking about the Silmaril and the Arkenstone.
Right.
And the way Corey Olson put it was something along the lines of within the context of the Legendarium, the Arkenstone is not a Silmaril, because it can't be, because we know that the Silmarils couldn't be shaped, and the dwarves shaped the Arkenstone, and they couldn't have touched it because mortal hands, blah blah blah.
Exactly.
He said, so it's on the one hand, it's definitely not a Silmaril, because that doesn't make sense within the Legendarium. He said, on the other hand, it's totally a Silmaril.
Oh, yeah.
And it's because Tolkien was sort of inspired by his own mythology. I think Ratliff even kind of talks about this idea that that Tolkien, just as he was inspired by Germanic mythology or medieval literature, any of the many things we know he was inspired by, he was even inspired by his earlier stories.
Exactly.
He was kind of drawing on his own homebrew mythology, I think Ratliff said. And I think that's what he's doing there. He's making a reference to the Silmarils, even to the name Arkenstone, which was
Eorkneston, right?
Right. That was the Old English word that he had used to refer to them in, I think it's in Shaping of Middle-earth now.
Yeah, for like holy stone or holy jewel.
Yeah. So I think maybe that might be what Professor Olson's thinking of as inconsistencies, or things that have not fully been worked in, but you can certainly see it almost kind of looks duplicative when you view the Legendarium as a whole. But I think it's just that he was sort of referencing himself. I don't know if I have a better answer than that for that.
Well, I think of one other sort of inconsistency, I guess, if you will, or contradiction, and that is Elrond. We talked about whether Elrond in The Hobbit was really going to be the same Elrond that was descended from Eärendil. And that sort of not quite fit. Like, he wanted this character to be kind of like this, and so he named him Elrond, and then only later did he decide that he's going to be the same Elrond that's descended from Eärendil. So I can see where
that's where we get
Professor
things like
Olsen's
him being
going
called
on
an elf friend as opposed to being an elf.
that. Just an elf, yeah.
We certainly worked hard to explain that in our episode on that chapter, but I mean,
I don't know that there is a firm answer.
Yeah, no, there's definitely some holes there, and I think even the sword. Elrond says this sword belonged to the King of Gondolin. He doesn't say the King of Gondolin, who, by the way, was my grandfather, and thank you for bringing my sword back
This
to me.
belonged to my grandfather.
Right. He says, oh, this was the King of Gondolin's, use it well, or whatever he says. And so we are left to sort of fill in the gaps with the knowledge that we have. And so we come up with a theory that I think is quite plausible as to what's going on there, but it is still somewhat inconsistent with the behavior in the story, no
There's
doubt.
just too many gaps to be 100% certain.
Yeah.
And that's, again, that's something that Tolkien just did on purpose in many ways. And when you realize how much he could have revised when he revised The Hobbit, after going back and fixing chapter 5, after after the Fellowship of the Ring came out, he very easily could have tied all these things together and cleaned them up and gotten rid of these inconsistencies, but he didn't. So, we have to just take them for what they are. Well, I think we have time for one more. If there's anybody who's brave enough to ask one last question, otherwise we can just wrap this up and call it a night, let everybody get to bed. It certainly is a late night. I'm not seeing any hands raised. So, folks, I think we're going to go ahead and call this the end. Well, I usually say great discussion to Shawn, but this time, really great discussion to all of you, and I really mean that. Thank you. Thank you to each of you for joining us for this first ever Questions After Nightfall episode, and my apologies to Lee and Chris, whose technical problems prevented them from joining us tonight. We do look forward to having them join us next time. This has been an absolutely interesting and very fun experiment. We haven't fallen flat on our faces quite as hard as I thought we would.
No, I thought, yeah.
But folks, please be sure to join us again next time. Thanks again to all of you, and a special thanks to our Patreon family.
Yes, thank you all who have joined us today. Really appreciate you guys joining us and coming up with some great questions and sharing your thoughts. A lot of fun there. And thank you to everybody who's listening. We hope you've all enjoyed it out there. And a very special thank you to everybody in our Patreon family who is making events like this one possible.
Absolutely. And we want to ask that, folks, if you believe we've earned your support here at the Prancing Pony Podcast, please consider joining the Fellowship of the Podcast at patreon.com/prancingponypod. It's thanks to the folks that joined us tonight and the rest of our Patreon family that we've been able to improve the show and bring in technology that allows us to have this many people on the show at once and do some other good things. And at least temporarily to move to weekly episodes. But you know what? We have another goal to reach. We would love to do a live show from an event like Mythmood next summer, but we're going to need your help to get there. Of course, we also have some really cool rewards, too, to make it worth your while, like exclusive content.
Well, and speaking of exclusive content, one of the things that our patrons receive every week when one of our new episodes come out is a about 10-minute postscript to each episode. We record the episodes in advance, as you know. We get a chance to listen to them before we release them. And so we use those postscripts as an opportunity to sort of clean up on any jokes we missed out on or things we wish we had kind of delved into a little bit more. And,
like the 57 T-Bird.
Yeah. Oh, man, I'm not going to live that one. That's going to be my...
Never. That's going to be your
T-Bird's going to be my
Tanniquettle.
Tanniquettle. I know.
Yeah, it's going to be your Tanniquettle.
Yeah. So, hey, we're going to be doing a postscript to this episode, too. We might come out with some a little bit more research to give a little bit better answers to some of these.
We might. That's a distinct possibility. We do record the special Patreon exclusive postscript, and we release it, or try to release it, the same day as the episode that it covers. So if you want access to that bonus, be sure to join the Fellowship of the Podcast. We also want to take a moment to thank those of you who have already joined. You really, truly are helping to make this show even better. And I don't want to forget a very special shout out to Jason in British Columbia. He's our patron at the Kierdance contribution tier. Wasn't able to join us tonight, but we're hoping he'll be able to join us next time.
Yep.
Folks, if you want a personalized shout out on our episodes, now you know where to go.
And while your support is really appreciated, and it truly is, we don't want you to feel obligated.
No.
If you can afford it, and if you think we've earned it, then please consider signing up. Otherwise, just keep listening to the podcast. We'll keep making it. It'll always be free. So you'll always have access to it there.
That's right. Well, folks, that does wrap it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. And as always, we thank you very much for joining us. Now, we are taking the Thanksgiving holiday off, so be sure to join us again in 2 weeks when we get to one of the most beloved and most important chapters in the entire Middle-earth legendarium, Riddles in the Dark.
Man, I got to say, I'm really looking forward to that one. I think that's going to be a lot of fun. I mean,
it's going to be a ton of fun. Ton of work, but a ton of fun.
It's going to be a lot of work. I think we're going to have to really dive into that first edition facsimile a little bit more.
We will. We will.
And we're really going to try and take our time with it.
Yes.
Because we really do want to bring in that early text, do a lot of comparing and contrasting. This is the only time we're going to see Gollum for a really long time. And we really want to spend some time with him and see how that character changed as Tolkien developed and sort of began to realize the true nature of that little ring that he had.
Absolutely. So if you don't have a priceless first edition in a locked cabinet somewhere, or at least a copy of the facsimile first edition that was recently released, well, now's a good time to pick up one of those. You can find the facsimile at the official library tab on our website, theprancingponypodcast.com. Now, as for a real first edition, you're on your own. The library, though, we've got links to everything from inexpensive paperbacks to really good stuff for your Tolkien collection.
And if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to head over to iTunes to leave us a review, we'd really appreciate that. Those reviews help us get more visibility in iTunes. That means more people find the podcast, and that means we have a bigger and more energized Tolkien community.
With more questions to ask.
With more questions.
And thanks to those of you who have, by the way. We do read all of them. We print them out and stick them on the wall. Okay, maybe not, but, we do certainly
I've got a few choice ones framed, I'll admit. Yeah.
They're pretty special stuff. I mean, sometimes I wonder, like, are you drinking something
are you
really
listening
good
to us?
when you're listening? Because I don't know. But we do really appreciate the nice things you say, even if we just believe half of them. But make sure that you never miss an episode of the show. If you haven't subscribed already, please do through iTunes or your favorite podcast app. You can find us in just about every podcast directory. And if you are on an iOS device, check out the podcast app on iOS 11 as it supports our new season tags and episode tags.
And that's been some pretty cool stuff there. Playing around with my podcast app. And we want to thank all of you who have become part of our social media family. We always say we set out to start a Tolkien conversation that everyone can join. And that's why we have the online common room on Facebook at the Prancing Pony Podcast and on Twitter at Prancing Pony Pod.
And one last thing, as always, don't forget to send your questions, comments, or your best Prancing Pony Podcast host stumpers to Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com. Again, that's our new email address, so be sure to take note if you haven't already. Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com, and we'll try to get him into our next episode. Well, an hour and a half is still far too short a time to spend amongst such excellent and admirable listeners, but until next time.
Farewell, friends.